And we're back, and just as I promised you a second ago, we remain on the subject of the national card scheme in Hungary. Hungary's decision to expand its national card immigration program to include Russians and Belarusians has sparked immediate criticism from the European People's Party and the European Commission. The new scheme threatens the integrity of the Schengen area and could pose a rather serious threat to European security, increasing risks of foreign intelligence permeating EU member states. And now, to discuss the possible scenarios and reflect on the latest developments, I'm joined by my next guest, Gábor Egry, the Director General at the Institute of Political History in Budapest. A very good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, and I'm really glad that you invited me. I'm honored.
The pleasure's all mine, as always. I wanted to start with a rather simple question, but the one that comes to mind first when we think of adding Russia and Belarus to this national card scheme. What does Hungary need Russians and Belarusians, the workers, for in their country? Is there any particular field? Is there anything in particular that we're looking into that they really need those extra people for, considering that there were other countries already involved in the scheme?
Well, usually the only very concrete example that is used to be given is the nuclear plant construction works at Paks. So Hungary is building, in cooperation with Russia, with the Rosatom, a new nuclear plant alongside the older one that was also a Soviet-constructed nuclear plant there. So this is what seems to be the most logical explanation to invite Russians. The only hole in this explanation is that so far there is no permission to construct this nuclear plant. So this is practically in the stage of digging and laying some concrete as the foundations. So there is no special expertise needed to this. On a more general level, it's very important to note that Hungary, just as many other European countries, are suffering from severe labor shortage, and therefore, since years, more and more, a growing number of guest workers are working in the country, mostly from Ukraine and Asian countries. But recently, there was a political backlash towards the presence of these guest workers, especially those around the construction of lithium battery factories in the country. So this is a relatively recent development that you already mentioned, that the government kept the number of eligible for working as guest workers. They put a restriction on the number, and the national card scheme is actually a way of circumventing those restrictions, as you also mentioned. So there is a certain economic logic, but so far there is not much presence, neither Belarusian nor Russian workers in Hungary.
I understand, but this is no coincidence that we are looking at Hungary that has been having ties with both of these countries. We're not only looking on economy, we're also looking on politics, on international politics, and quite frankly, on a possibility of further hybrid warfare. With these two countries, we've seen that there's been massive intelligence breach before, so there must be definitely something to it. What's your opinion on this?
I think that any kind of suspicion is justified. So, and not just all these examples of this Russian so-called spy bank that was operating in Hungary and was expelled under very heavy U.S. pressure very recently, practically under the threat of sanctions by the U.S. State Department. But also, Hungary had previously a golden visa scheme in place, and we know concrete examples of family members of Russian high-ranking spies actually settling in Budapest with the help of this golden visa scheme. We know a serious breach of the IT system of the Hungarian foreign ministry that was never reported, and there are all kinds of informations, obviously never really confirmed officially, that Western intelligence services are actually withholding information from the Hungarian intelligence services. So there is certainly a degradation of the relationship between Hungary and its allies, and it's a good reason to see this development in the light of these prior problems with the Hungarian-Western relationship.
Earlier, we heard from András Recs, who's a senior fellow from the German Council on Foreign Relations. He spoke to Forbes Hungary, and he said, I quote, "I see this as a serious potential national security risk depending on how many people come." What do you think? What kind of risks Hungary could face with such a major influx of workers from Russia and Belarus? Is it something that only other EU member states should be worried about, or is there something that Hungary should worry about as well?
It's hard to see because, as I already mentioned, there is not yet a large presence of either Belarusian or Russian workers in Hungary. And frankly speaking, apart from the Paks nuclear power plant, it's very hard to see where they would come, given that the competition is from countries from where people are probably accepting lower wages and worse work conditions, and that it's usually what matters. So this is all really the aspect of the scheme that seems to be dangerous is more how much freedom it gives for people who could get access to the national card to move around. So it could be either a few dozen people who will be, because actually people who are operating a business in Hungary are also eligible for this card, so not just workers. That could either be a few dozen covered agents who will be operating as alleged businessmen, or we can have a relatively large number of Russians coming to Paks, where I think that the nuclear plant is so far relatively popular. So I don't really see how that there would be a locally a political or popular backlash. So I would wait to see actually that whether really thousands of guest workers will come. The more imminent threat is, I think, that it's a loophole that individuals could use in a targeted way to get into the EU and gain the right of free movement within the Schengen area.
Which takes me exactly to my next question, because we heard from the European People's Party leader, Manfred Weber, and he said that this is likely going to become an issue when it comes to the security within the Schengen area. And he said the lack of a clear need for such a broad and unregulated entry mechanism for Russian and Belarusian workers poses questions over the consequences for Hungary and the wider Schengen area. Is there a real risk for the Schengen area? What are we to expect? What could be the possible scenarios? Obviously, as you mentioned a second ago, we have to work of an assumption that such things are going to take place, and there's going to be a major influx of workers from both of these countries and possibly intelligence. But what's the risk for the Schengen area? What are we looking at here?
As it was stated, this national card differs from different type of work permit. So it gives really a free movement around the Schengen area. And you see that, again, even just reading the news, it's, frankly speaking, quite stunning how flexible the Russian security agencies could be to disguise their agents. Obviously, free movement is very important for these agents. And we also saw very significant attempts to take down European infrastructure, not just recently, but we can go back to the incidents in Bulgaria or in the Czech arms factory, or the foiled attempt that the Germans announced to have foiled. So every gate that is more open than it should be, where security clearance is laxer than it should be, is dangerous. And yes, it's also, if it comes to a larger influx of Russian workers with this scheme, it's obvious that it's easier to hide there some people who are not really coming to work on the nuclear plant, but will move around or will establish themselves as some kind of agents in the area. On another note, it's also important to mention that the Hungarian government is actually planning to reinstate a new golden visa scheme. So it's also important to look at this development as well. Maybe in a few months' time, we will see that there will be more than one way of getting easier or getting very easily into Hungary.
So what do you think are going to be the measures that EU is going to take in order to protect the Schengen area? Because obviously now that they know that such schemes, and as you mentioned, the golden visa scheme possibly coming in a few weeks or months' time, there's going to be more ways for people from outside of the EU to get through and move across the member states. What do you think the EU is going to do in order to stop that from happening?
It's very hard to see around the present legal conditions what the EU could do, as long as they don't, in a very concrete way, try to close the Hungarian borders. So far, what I see is political reactions. They are trying to make credible threats that somehow they would damage Hungary. But it obviously couldn't simply be just a legal measure that is usual in the case of the Commission, some kind of inquiry or later an infringement procedure, because it takes time, and the Hungarian state can keep in place any kind of scheme as long as it is not vetoed by the European Court of Justice, found in breach of the EU law. So this is one way. They could actually try to exert pressure through the intelligence services. That's one way, or threatening to cut or degrade cooperation that might be hurtful of Hungary. That's what I see so far, and this is a very dire situation. I mean, it tells a lot about how much the EU is not capable to cope with a member state that is not really adhering to the principle of sincere cooperation within the bloc.
Ahead of the EU parliamentary elections taking place earlier this year, Hungary was, by many experts and commentators, called the enfant terrible of Europe. How do you think, with each and every step that Viktor Orbán is taking, what is the political future for Hungary? Is Hungary moving further away from the EU? Is there a possibility of a new alliance in the cards? Because judging by what's happening, a lot of people are wondering about that.
Yes, that's a possibility. I mean, there is one, and this was said clearly by Orbán and his new so-called political director, Balázs Orbán, who is not a relative. It's important to mention. So they outlined what they call the new grand strategy of Hungary, based on connectivity, keeping relations with all the emerging new global powers, and trying to capitalize on this alleged ability of Hungary of being able to talk to all kinds of competing global powers, also reaping economic benefits. This is always a problem, how long Hungary is useful for these allies or relations outside of Europe. So the spur of lithium battery factory constructions is obviously a way of trying to make Hungary more useful for countries like China as a bridgehead within Europe. The nuclear factory, and just recently, it was not from the government, still just an expert, someone actually mentioned that Hungary might build a third nuclear plant in cooperation with the Russians. So that's also a way of fostering ties that are supposed to be stronger and lasting with Russia. And there is an aspect that is rarely mentioned, but that's also important.
I'm sorry, unfortunately our time has come to an end here on our program, but thank you very much for your invaluable insight. We'll definitely be back to talk more on the latest developments. Gábor Egry, Director General, Institute of Political History in Budapest, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure's all mine. And so this would be all the latest on the subject of the national cards in Hungary. You were watching World Talks Context. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska. Please stay tuned.